I really wanted to start in somewhere where Eric left off, but start with a quote from Makala, actually, when he says that time's a cycle, not a line. And that point about the changing nature of capitalism and what you see across the world of governments actually playing a role to facilitate the operations of corporations, of course, is a bit of a cycle. Because when we talk about colonialism and when we talk about the British Empire and the growth of British Empire, what many people don't say, well, that was a private enterprise initiative. Those companies that were by royal charter had their own private armies. You can see many of those features in what we see today in global companies who have their own security forces, who intervene in countries if they don't get their own way to start wars, who use force and violence in exactly the same way as what we see as past colonial times to ensure that they're able to make their profits. So in talking about this, I think it's important that we recognise that as a backdrop. And I suppose, you know, in sort of prefacing my remarks, you know, I know there's a lot of controversy around the use of political blackness. I suppose as a trade unionist and somebody who organises the TUC Black Workers Conference, it's sort of the last bastion where that term black worker is. But I don't think that's an accident, because it's not about black, it's about workers. Right, and people understanding that actually they have to have solidarity if they're going to struggle in the workplace. But what I'm going to do to talk a bit about is about the political philosophy and the political narrative that we've got today around the language that's used. But I'm going to start off by just saying a little story, which is, when I first went to secondary school, I had to get on a bus, which was busing kids to the school that I went to in Gravesend. And I had this ongoing sort of spat with the bus driver for about a month, who insisted on wanting to call me Chalky, right? And I'd say, my name's not Chalky, my name's Wilf, right? And reflecting back on it later, I thought, you know, when I developed some politics, I thought, well, clearly he wasn't calling me Chalky because, or wanting to call me Chalky because that was some kind of an affectionate nickname that he wanted to give to me. No, in reality, he was making a clear political statement, and that clear political statement, whether he was conscious of it or not, was that I was non-white, right, and that he was implicitly part of that white tribal loyalness that meant that he could differentiate himself in terms of power and status from me. And ultimately, you know, when you come down to everyday acts of thinking about what does white supremacy mean, it's that kind of thing in ordinary terms, and it still goes on. But in terms of that, one of the things that I think that we often refer to is the struggle. You know, the struggle for racial equality. But in that, I think we often forget there's an opposition, right? And that opposition is doing everything to maintain that inequality, because basically capitalism, inequality is intrinsic to capitalism. And so we really have to think about that, because actually in the battle for political narrative, race is a central theme in that battle. And often I think when we think about what we're doing and how we're trying to build solidarity, we forget about the opposition and what it's doing and how it imposes ideas on working class people. And you can't divide race from class. And especially in terms of modern day neoliberal ideology, that whole idea of the individual, you know, Margaret Thatcher said it, there's no such thing as society. And what we've seen is the growth of the cult of the individual, along with consumerism, and that permeates everything, not just about not just about race. I'm fed up with saying to academics, stop talking about social capital. Why are you talking about people's experiences in relation to market exchange? Every aspect of our life is being turned into a market exchange. And so we can't think that that doesn't apply and it doesn't have implications for the struggle over political narrative around race. You know, how is it that Martin Luther King has now almost become a national treasure, right? Right? Because it's about individualizing him as this character who was against non-violence, right? Whereas at the time, right, he was a Jacob who was #1 American enemy, right? Because he organised the March on Washington. And let's remember, the March on Washington wasn't just against racism. The March on Washington was for jobs and freedom, right? And that's really important. What Hoover saw was actually an attempt by what I would describe as part of the Black human rights movement that was going on in the States at the time and beginning to develop, to break white solidarity, right, in relation to capitalism. Through actually bringing forward the commonality of the experience of repression of Black and white people in that structure. And so we have to remember that, because actually, as I said, in response to the fear that organising amongst Black communities here engendered in the establishment, yeah, they changed their tactics, not only in relation to dividing communities through multiculturalism, but also in the political language that got used, and it's progressed. So, you know, when I was first active, we were fighting freedom and exploitation and oppression, and that was what the Black movement was about. Blackness was never an identity; it was a movement. It was politics, and that gets gradually over the years degraded to, well, suddenly we're just fighting discrimination, right? And you see the beginning of the individualization process. And then it's about equal opportunities. Hey, let's all have equal opportunities. We'll forget about 600 years of slavery, indentured labor, colonization, and the robbing of our lands, and the efforts that people made to build this country. And as I often say when I'm talking to historians, actually the British working class was mainly non-white. You just, in terms of modern day national configurations, reduce it to, England often. And finally, we're at this ridiculous situation where we talk about diversity and inclusion, managements, I say, well, what we're trying to do is diversify our workforce. And I say, well, you've got a diversified workforce, right? That is not the problem. The problem is the exploitation of those people that are regarded as non-white at the bottom of it. So we have to understand that in terms of political blackness and political narratives, blackness was always about the fact that racism was a structure of power. And it wasn't about identity. It wasn't about skin colour. And it's important to say that, although obviously within it, colorism is an important element. But, as the brilliant American historian Cedric Robinson pointed out in his book, Black Marxism, the function of racializing people was always a function of colonizing people. And that was happening in Europe before they ever went to Africa. It was happening with the Jews, it was happening with the Irish, it was happening with various other groups. So, in terms of the development of capitalism, racialism to colonize working class people has always been an integral function, right, of exploitation. And we have to remember that. And so, where does racism fit in terms of how it moved on? Well, it was clearly, it was, about actually making a white working class that they needed identify with the ruling class, and it played that function. And it was bound up with racial myths that were created of whiteness, although they're not explicit. And in Britain, the greatest racial myth, of course, is the myth of the Anglo-Saxon. And it's important to mention that because it's still part of the modern day British nationalism that we see when people talk about British values and culture, and that the right play into in terms of Anglo-Saxon and Celtic myths. And so it's really important that we understand that history, and everybody understands that history in terms of knowing where we come from, to understand where we are now, especially in the British context. It's no good looking across the other side of the Atlantic, you know. Here we are in the belly of the beast in terms of ideology, you know. Trump didn't invent the ideology, it was invented here. And in fact, many of the things that Trump talks about, we were already doing before he was, you know, he was elected, whether it was, you know, whether it was wars against migrants in Europe or, you know, oppression of migrant workers, we were already doing them here. So these myths, these racial myths of whiteness continue to function to capture white working class people and to fuse their identity in terms of concepts through whiteness and masculinity. And I think, you know, it's important when we think about this in terms of narratives, that we have to understand that in creating a narrative of solidarity, it's not it can't be a narrative of solidarity in terms of identity. You know, whiteness is not an identity. It's a political, it's a political construction. And often we only look at our own constructions that we're constructed under, not the other construction as well. You know, white people aren't all the same, right? They've got different cultural and national identities, right? But they don't spend their time saying, oh, well, you know, or very rarely when it comes to matters of exploitation or to fighting, oh, well, no, I can't talk to you because you're Welsh, right? Right, I'm a Scots, right? And you haven't been very kind to, you Welsh haven't been very kind to us Scots, you know? They don't do that. They understand, you know, it's about understanding what the name of the game is and what the prize is, you know. So very much for me, I mean, I think we have to understand the concept of political blackness, but remember that ultimately, it's not about identity, it's about struggle, right? And it's about fighting. It's about fighting that struggle against racism, imperialism, and colonialism. Even in this modern world, even people don't recognise it. Because ultimately, that fight isn't about saving black people, right? That fight is about saving the world, right? Because that's the fight against the violence that we experience every day, not just here, but globally, not just in relation to people, but in relation to our planet, right? And then the time is urgent. We cannot continue to look at race and look at other forms of discrimination just as an identity or a cultural issue. We have to repoliticise the struggle, because that's the only way we're going to win it.